Hi, and welcome to the Emerging Technologies Horizons podcast. My name is Arun Seraphin. I'm the Deputy Director here at NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute, guest hosting for Dr. Mark Lewis. And I'm really pleased to have as our guest today Dr. Daniel Gerstein of RAND, who is here to talk to us about science and technology policy, and particularly some of the global aspects of science and technology policy, and particularly some of the aspects of how science and technology policy needs to be modified and thought about differently in today's ever-changing, faster-paced technology world, as well as the new world of a global economic competition. Dr. Gerstein, thank you for joining us. Let me do a little bit of your bio, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of your more recent work and some of your past work, because you've been a player in this space for many decades now. Dr. Gerstein is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. He's a very distinguished career. Previously served as an acting undersecretary and deputy undersecretary in the Science and Technology Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. He has extensive experience in security and defense, serving as an SES and as a government civilian in uniform and in industry. He's also an adjunct professor at American University in Washington, D.C. At DHS, he managed the directorate's $1 billion science and technology budget and spearheaded several cross-departmental efforts in things like big data, cybersecurity, and very well known for all of his work in biodefense over the years. His most recent book, it's called Tech Wars, Transforming U.S. Technology Development. It explores the evolution of the current U.S. R&D enterprise and proposes some strategies for better preparing the global technology race shaping our future. And I hope to delve into that a little bit with you today, sir. You began your professional career in the U.S. Army, serving on 4 continents, participating in a range of combat, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, counterterrorism, and homeland security missions. Following retirement from active duty, you joined industry, L3 Corporation, working in Homeland Security Services. Prior to your work at DHS, you were also in the Pentagon in OSD policy, working on countering WMD issues, weapons of mass destruction issues. And then people who know Dr. Gerstein know that you pick up a rock and he seems to be working in that field. Everything ranging from negotiating peace settlement in Bosnia as part of the Holbrooke delegation, to working in Southcom on cybersecurity issues, to biosurveillance systems for DoD. And so it's a pleasure, after all these years of working with and around you, to have you as a guest here on the podcast. So let me just, after that attempted intro in your bio, talk a little bit about your background and how you got here. It doesn't seem like the most direct path. And so how did you end up where you got today, and how much of that was planned and how much of that was happenstance?
Well, thanks for that very kind introduction, Arun. It seems to go on and on, which just means I'm very old and I've spent a lot of time in these areas. But it's interesting when you think about your professional career. It spans a number of decades, but some common themes emerge in all of this. And really, for me, it's about security and defense. It's looking at those kinds of issues that threaten the United States, that threaten our way of life. And so, while it doesn't seem like there's a direct linkage, say, between serving in combat and doing, global public health and looking at pandemic preventions, it really is about sort of a, security and defense overview, but then also trying to make the world a little bit of a better place, better institutions.
And so, I don't know, let's play a thought experiment here. Can you give us an example of how that combat experience then helps you shape making recommendations on technology policy?
Yeah, so when I was in the Army and serving in a combat role, I was a Signal Corps officer. So I had responsibility for putting in an entire network during Desert Storm. And, if you'll recall back to Desert Storm, they called it the 100-hour war. And essentially, we had to develop about a 220-kilometer network where nothing existed in the desert. And then support the frontline troops. And so, when I think about that, it's all about trying to put in this very technical capacity. And again, it dovetails a lot of what goes on in networks and communications actually has some sort of relationship to, say, the way disease spreads. When you think about the propagation of radio signals versus, the propagation of diseases. So, it's just interesting that many of these different opportunities wound up kind of coming together in some very interesting ways.
So that's great. So let's talk about some of your recent work in tech policy. The new book, Tech Wars: Transforming U.S. Technology Development, available at Amazon.com. I'm sure other places as well. Um, Tell us a little bit about the U.S. S&T enterprise. Right, it's something that's easy to complain about, and people often do. So let's start the opposite way. What are some of the strengths and advantages to the U.S. S&T enterprise?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that the technology enterprise of the United States is very interesting. It's kind of grown up organically. It really, when you think about the modern age of the S&T enterprise, you go back to the post World War II period, and there were decisions made at that time. Should we have a connected model where you have directed ways in which you do research and development and those translate into fielding of capabilities? Or should you allow it to be a disconnected approach where it just kind of grows up around areas that turn out to be profitable and contribute to national security? And as it turns out over time, we've kind of developed a hybrid model. And it includes, for example, government has an important role to play. Businesses have an enormously important role, whether it's large integrators all the way down to small and medium sized companies, and even venture capitalists. Academia and our national laboratory systems are absolutely essential. And what do all of these different pieces do as they come together? Well, interestingly, the national laboratories and academia really have a very significant role in the basic and early applied research. That is, the fundamental understandings about science and technology. As you go up the food chain, so to speak, that's small businesses and venture capitalists who propel these scientific discoveries and early technological work into something that might eventually be commercialized or used in national security. And government has a role in both stimulating the early research as well as promoting the technologies. And so all of this comes together. But one of the interesting things as I was doing my research for the book is to think about, our system, our enterprise is sometimes referred to as a non-system. It's not as though it is well defined and everybody has their predetermined only role that they play. There's actually a good bit of coming together in this organic fashion. And I
And
think
are
I
you
think
gonna
one
are you
of
gonna tell me that that's a feature, not a bug?
I am going to tell you that, and I was about to say, what it really entails is this is how science, technology, and innovation actually occur. And in other countries where, and I'll just mention China and Russia that have authoritarian governments, it's actually more challenging for them to innovate. And we've seen that if you go back to the history after the Bolshevik Revolution with the Russians or Soviets at that time, they disconnected their academic personnel from their and from their research and disconnected that from the requirements process. And so they had these systems that didn't work together. Hence, all the research and development that they wound up doing was all directed toward government. It didn't really have a consumer role. It's not as though they were developing technologies for new refrigerators and internets and things. They were focused on tanks and artillery and missiles. And so, that's how, when you have a command economy, that's what you get.
So there's so many different places to go with that. Let me just say on the command economy piece, um, talk about whether there's actually some efficiency that's at least gained from a command economy. If I think about uh, a, a national system today where there's so many, we'll call them innovators, who are outside the defense space that want to get in, but without a controlled system, it's, there's an opportunity to get in, but there's chaos in trying to get in. And then I'll say the other end of the spectrum is a command economy, let's say in the national defense space. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but something that's more classified like biodefense or nuclear weapons has to be more of a controlled and command economy. And so there must be benefits and trade-offs to both. Where do we sit on that spectrum in different sectors, and why, and are we in the right place?
Well, the beginning of the story actually starts with the federal government role in many respects. When you think about some of the technologies, and we can go all the way back into the 1800s, and to think about the Transcontinental Railroad, which was actually stimulated by federal funding trying to connect the country. And we saw, the Eisenhower years with the federal highway system, which had a role for both national security, but also economic capacity. And what's been interesting is that the federal government plays this role and finds ways in which to signal the importance of certain areas and to stimulate those particular areas. Another great one, which we're seeing grow in leaps and bounds, is space. You can trace it back to 1957 or actually post World War II. But, the Sputnik moment creates a space race. And that puts a man on the moon. The United States puts a man on the moon by the end of the next decade. Pretty spectacular stuff. But look at what we have today. It is a commercialized system where the industry leaders, the leaders of space discovery now, is really the commercial sector. SpaceX and the Blue Origins and such. They are the ones who are continuing to move forward. Now, it's not that the federal government's uninvolved, but you can see that the federal government provided the seed corn, and now we have this great economic boom as a result of what's coming on in space. We see the same thing with the internet, where the government does the early funding, and that results in e-commerce and social media and all of the other developments that surround internet and now Internet of Things capabilities that are being developed and fielded. So it's a very interesting system, and it's really opportunistic for people and companies to look at and to identify areas where they want to participate and play a leadership role.
So thinking about NDIA's membership, which is NDIA is a big organization. We've got some large defense contractors, prime contractors. We've got lots of small businesses and universities. So let me pick out a subset of them. Let's pretend you're talking to the primes, the big guys, and you're describing this world now of commercial global innovation, where the government plays maybe that role of early stage investor and then setting standards and buying at the end. How does a big guy now, growing up in a slightly different world, reposition themselves in this world? What would your advice be to them?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I found interesting in researching both my earlier book, The Story of Technology, and then this book, Tech Wars, is I did an interview of a couple companies, and I'll just share with you. One of the companies I talked to was Boeing. And I talked about how do you do research and development in an environment where there are so many actors and there's not enough money to invest in research and development in all the areas. And the gentleman from their research and development organization said, we think about tapping the trillion. There's $1 trillion of research and development. And our goal is to figure out those areas that we need to invest in because they're our core capability, our core competency. And there are others where we can find a small business who is working in that field. We might acquire that small business. We might just acquire the intellectual property or pay the royalties for the intellectual property and to be able to use that. So what that tells me is that even if you're a large company, there are certain things that you are going to spend your research dollars on, but there are other things that you may either buy commercially from others, or you may try to buy that intellectual property and bring it together for the system that you are trying to build. So I thought that was a really interesting approach to the way companies try to maximize their research and development funds.
And okay, now a different part of this industrial base are small businesses who've traditionally worked with DoD over the years in every technology that DoD fields, providing subsystems, providing services. Uh, in the last decade or so, a whole set of new companies, some venture funded, some with a lot of commercial experience, are also trying to break into this defense market. Uh, one, is that a good thing? Second, what advice do you give to those traditional defense contractors to maintain their position in this space?
Well, I think it's a great thing, actually, because it's going to stimulate additional innovation. It's going to bring new technologies forward much more rapidly. So, not to be overly harsh on critiquing the government's role, but sometimes the government, with its federal acquisition regulations and all that comes with that, can be laborious and cumbersome to get through. And I think what the government has to do is much like Boeing had to do, and that is to say, what are those things that we should invest in because nobody else does it and we really need that technology? And what are those things that we should buy commercially off the shelf or, try to, stimulate new areas? And what I find fascinating about this is we have a lot of examples in front of us. When I was in government, we had certain capabilities for looking at biodefense laboratories that we had that were very unique, and those we needed to fund. But there were other areas where commercial industry had far outpaced us. Likewise, in explosives detection, there were things that academia and some of the small businesses were doing that we just needed to hire them to be able to do the algorithm development for advanced imaging in airports and such. And we didn't need to try to do that internally. The government, though, in all of this needs to become a better consumer. I always ask myself, why should the government now be investing in enterprise software as unique capabilities unless there is something unique about it? If not, aren't there commercial companies who have already perfected the enterprise software market, whether it's from human resources to payroll and everything in between?
But traditionally, the way we build the government's technical workforce is aimed for a world where either the government is building technology, like at some of the labs you're talking about, or where the government is the biggest buyer of a technology. And traditionally, over the decades, we needed our workforce to play in that world. You're describing a different world today. Do we need a different kind of workforce? And if so, where does the government find that workforce?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I do in Tech Wars is I contemplate what changes are required. And there are a host of organizational changes that I would propose. There's certainly changes in all of the branches of government. And of course, you've hit on it, and that is the workforce. We need to think about how we retain and recruit and retain to be able to maximize the workforce we have. And there will be certain jobs that will remain inherently governmental functions. But there are also other opportunities to broaden the workforce. And we can do that through a better immigration system, can be helpful. Trying to attract the best talent in STEM is one way. Another way to look at this also is to ensure that we are understanding where these inherently governmental functions are and working toward those so that they're absolutely key to moving forward. Part of this also about the future workforce is to understand concepts like human machine teaming. And I'll just use the AI machine human teaming as kind of the example. There are going to be functions that we're going to become more comfortable having artificial intelligence be part of. But we need to grow into that. It can't just be all of a sudden we're using artificial intelligence to run battles. And again, inherently human functions and inherently governmental functions. And so separating those out, I think, is really very important. We also need friendly policies with regard to the workforce. Perhaps greater transition between government and industry so that we can attract some of the best and brightest who want to come and spend time in government. I mean, for example, I think government's got some of the most interesting problem sets. And there's a lot to be learned by being in government and understanding those problem sets. You will be better in industry if you've had some time in government. And likewise, I think government people would do better to actually understand the pressures of industry and how industry operates so that the two can become better aligned and we can take some of this non-system approach and make it more of a system, a true system.
That's great. Along the lines of those kinds of changes, looking at the book, if you were king for a day or president for a day or science advisor for a day, what's one major policy change you might make, even for just one agency, that you think would move things in the right direction?
So one of my major findings is that I believe that we need to take the Department of Commerce and make it the Department of Technology and Commerce. And along with that, we need to add a number of very important functions. I mean, Commerce has already got the backbone with its Bureau of Industry Security, BIS, that does export controls. But it also has patents and trademarks and NIST that does measurements and standards. But there are some things that are really missing. We need to have a true national science and technology intelligence function. We need to be scanning the horizon and understanding how technologies are maturing across the globe, which could present dangers to the United States, to the globe, to the world population. We need to do better horizon scanning, better predictive analysis. I'm a big fan of net assessments, actually understanding how the new technologies are likely to change the balances of power, the balances of economic power, the balances of social power. I also think we need to transition much more rapidly between research and early development to development and life cycle improvements. And so I think this Department of Commerce would have an incredible Department of Technology and Commerce would have an incredible role to be played there. I would just say one other thing about the legislative and the judicial branch. In terms of legislative branch, which I know you know very well, there was an organization that was lasted about 20 years, from the 70s to 1993 or 4, called the Office of Technology Assessment. And it was a very important office. It had about 700 people. Why was it important? Because many of our Congress people who are serving don't have technical backgrounds. And this provided a group of people who could serve as informing the legislative branch. And, I think that's sometimes more important than just the executive branch trying to do the informing, because sometimes there may be this tension between legislative and executive. So it would be nice for them to have that office stood up again. And I'd also make the play that in the judicial space, the judicial branch, it takes way too long to actually get laws and policies in place. And this is really a difficult problem to overcome. Just, by way of an example, I mean, we seem to have 18th century judicial system trying to manage 21st century technology development. And I would like to see ability to put laws in place much earlier. Just take social media as the example. Social media came into being in the mid 90s. By 2006, it was pretty clear that it had become a very important thing. that it was there were some misuses already at that point. And yet it's been, almost 20 years since then, and we still don't have very good social media laws. And we're still not in agreement about what we should do with respect to data privacy and those kinds of protections. And, we've seen the outcome in things like the election interference that was done through social media. So we really needed to be more proactive in all three of the branches of government.
That's great. We've never really had a concerted effort to do science and technology for the government, right? Either development of people or development of technologies to support government processes. I think pointing at all of that and starting some initiatives in that direction would be great. Certainly, I would have been helped greatly if those kinds of things of OTA had existed when I was on the Hill. So we're gonna have to close up soon here. I want to ask you one question, which may be too much for the last question, but the book's called Tech War. China is hovering in the background of all of these conversations. What step would you take to make it less of a war and more of a partnership between the U.S. and China in these kinds of technology spaces?
Yeah, that's really both a terrific question and a great way to wind up this discussion. China has been a difficult actor. I'll just put it in that way. But they have grown enormously over the last 20 years. And, at times I feel like we're setting ourselves up for a direct confrontation with China across, political, military, economic areas. And I'm not sure that's the right approach. China has matured. They have grown from 2000 to the present by entering the World Trade Organization and the global economic markets. They are now the second largest economy. Some would even say they're the first largest economy if you count PPP, the parity adjusted pricing. So they are a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, they have done a lot of activities. They have been involved in a lot of activities, intellectual property theft, trying to gain access to our companies and all of the technologies associated with those companies. They have been bad actors with regard to social media score, social credit scores, and their very draconian approaches in with their own populations, with the data that is generated. But having said all that, I'm very encouraged by the Science and Chips Act of 2022 and the very, I would say, firm approaches that are taken in there. And I think we are signaling to China that if you are not going to be a responsible actor, then we are going to move away from doing a lot of, if you will, collaboration on economic issues. And with the Science and Chips Act, we are seeing that there's a big push with regard to semiconductors. That doesn't mean we should draw red lines, but we also need to make them understand that this is very important to us, and they need to accommodate and not try to continue to steal the intellectual property. They need to be a better actor, a better partner and collaborator. And there are many events, many types of ways we need to collaborate, whether it's global markets, whether it's Iran nuclear program, whether it's North Korea. We need to be able to collaborate. And so it's important to find this middle point and not necessarily have it come to some sort of place where we don't want to be politically, militarily, economically. They are the second largest country economically, and we don't want to necessarily decouple, I don't think, our entire approaches to the way we share and interact.
Well, that's great. You describe a complex balancing act, and we hope the U.S. government decision makers, policymakers are up to the task. If you are all are interested in learning more about this, I urge you to look at the book Tech Wars: Transforming U.S. Technology Development. In fact, all the works of Dr. Gerstein over the years. Dan, I want to thank you for being a guest today on the podcast, Emerging Tech Horizons. And bring it to a close, I just want to let the viewers know that the Emerging Technologies Institute is continuing to do a lot of the activities that we have over the last year. Our podcast series, our Technology 101 educational series, and coming up in August, a emerging technology conference in Washington, D.C., where we'll explore some of these issues and poke at some of the challenges and opportunities in moving new technologies more rapidly into the hands of DoD operators. So with that, I'll close, and thanks very much, Dr. Gerstein, for a good conversation.
Thanks, Arun. Nice to see you again.